Welcome to Herself, a space for women to have deep conversations about the intersection between spiritual entrepreneurship and fulfilling your potential, so you can become the woman you truly are in every area of your life. After being in business for over 2 decades, I've learned, as you likely have too, that as you grow your business grows you in unexpected, often challenging, yet miraculous ways. Here, we'll talk about how to get out of your own way so you can grow a business that's abundant and sustainable while allowing you to be a force for good in the world. I'll give you simple, actionable strategies as well as wisdom and inspiration to help you root into your wholeness, lead from your values, and work in ways that feel deeply aligned so you can bring your true self into the world through your business and in every area of your life. I'm a few days into my sabbatical for the month of August, and while I'm away, I wanted to share with you a very intimate conversation that I had this spring around my new book, Handbook for the Heartbroken. So it's about grief and heartbreak, and it is with a woman named Sarah Tacy, whom I met through a mutual friend and colleague, Jen Rasiopi, who's been on this podcast a few times, most recently also this past spring. And I love Sarah's podcast. It's called Threshold Moments. She is a former mind-body trainer to Olympians and a nervous system and somatic healing expert. And I just really loved this conversation. It felt less like an interview and more like a supportive truth-telling session with a close friend. And I did a lot of interviews with my book this past spring, and this was one of my favorites. We went to such deep places, and I was so moved by our time together that I wanted to share this conversation with you too. So together, Sarah and I explore how I learned to trust myself and connect with my deep truth after a significant betrayal. We talk about a potential new archetype for women in mid-adulthood beyond the archetype of mother and queen, the power of processing grief through community instead of just on our own. And we share really tender ways that we both healed after complicated abortions. We talked about how moving through dark times can lead to profound personal growth. This was true for both of us. We also explore the role of anger that comes up during heartbreak and how to relate to it. And when we do all of this, we can start to see what may be waiting for us on the other side of heartbreak, loss, and grief. So may this be a benefit to you and whatever thresholds of grief and heartbreak, past or present, little or large, you may be facing. Enjoy this conversation with Sarah Tacy.
Welcome to Threshold Moments. Today we have with us Sarah Avant Stover, and I will start with her official bio and then we'll get into the conversation. Sarah Avant Stover is a certified internal family systems practitioner and teacher and mentor of women's spirituality, empowerment, and entrepreneurship. She is also the author of The Way of the Happy Woman, the Book of She, and a handbook for the heartbroken, which is coming out just about the time that this podcast will launch. After graduating Phi Beta Kappa and Summa Cum Laude from Columbia University's all-women's Barnard College, Sarah had a cancer scare, moved to Thailand, and there embarked on a decade-long healing and spiritual odyssey throughout Asia. Since then, she's gone on to uplift tens of thousands of women worldwide. Sarah specializes in supporting women to discover and fulfill their true potential at the intersection where entrepreneurship meets personal and spiritual growth. She has been featured in Yoga Journal, The Huffington Post, Newsweek, Natural Health, and on ABC, NBC, and CBS. She lives in Boulder, Colorado, and is online at sarahavantstover.com. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
You had options on your media kit for the short, medium, or long, and sometimes I go a little bit longer just to help give some orientation points, so that even though all the accomplishments aren't truly what add up to what our worth is or why we would be here speaking, it can sometimes orient people to a story. So I went for the long version. And at the end, as I was reading it off, I'm like, and Huffington Post. You've done a lot of things. Sometimes what I think is really interesting, and I'll speak for myself in this field of wellness and growth, is that there's no bypassing heartbreak. There, in my experience, are not the right tools or enough tools. There can be lifelines. But I think sometimes one on the outside could think, oh, if they are teaching these things, then they'll never be bothered. They'll be like the Dalai Lama. And one might project that the Dalai Lama is never bothered and it'll be all peaceful. And I think that thought has disrupted me sometimes. And you speak about that a bit in your book, like the shame that can come with various aspects. And I think that is why I found your book to be so helpful, is to hear an honest path of somebody who's been on this journey of awakening and coming back to their true self over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to highlight. Is one of the struggles that I had on my heartbreak journey. And just to orient listeners, this book is about serial heartbreaks that I experienced between 2016 and 2020 in literally every area of my life: my intimate relationship, my friendships, my health, my sense of identity, my career, my finances, just across the board. And I don't think I had any role models to look to. Someone gave me an advanced copy of Glennon Doyle's Love Warrior after the first heartbreak, which was a betrayal with my former fiance. That was a lifeline at that time because I could really see in another woman who'd gone through something similar as me. But a lot of the other ones, I didn't have anywhere to really look or orient. And so one of my intentions with writing this book was to validate this process that you said, well, none of us can escape heartbreak, and to really be, like you said, like that lifeline for women or for anyone who feels called to read it as they're going through those very dark valleys of their own lives.
And one of the parts that I say at the beginning of the podcast is that this podcast is about accompaniment. So some of it is like, oh, isn't it great that we might gain tools? But there is certainly something to be said to know that we're not alone, that we're not the only one. Not that we would like wish others to come into the dark night with us, but sometimes actually, I'm going to speak for myself, like sometimes being so alone in the dark night, if I had known that anybody else was there, it would have been wildly helpful. Yeah.
I felt the exact same way. We are the ones that need to go through it. No one can do it for us. But it does make it easier just to feel a presence with us, even if it's not an actual physical presence. And that's really what I want this book to be for women. Like it has its own energy, it has its own transmission, to be that accompaniment, to be that companion during those very intimate and often very isolating times.
You, at the very beginning of the book, and I may say it wrong, so you could correct me, gave a word. I don't know, if it's a Greek word or if that's where you're getting the origin from, cannabis?
I first discovered it through a Dharma talk with Jack Kornfield. And it just really, I discovered it several years ago and it just really struck me. It's like, yes, this is what I'm experiencing. So forgive us if we're mispronouncing it, but something along those lines. Yes.
Yeah. And can you describe that for us?
It is defined as a blow that sets your life spinning in an entirely different direction. And I think that most of us, especially when we reach our 40s, definitely our 50s, have experienced at least one thing that has altered the course of our lives to the point that the lives that we're living by that time are different than the lives that we had imagined for ourselves when we were younger. And so the katabus for me was the night that my former fiance came home and told me that he'd been cheating on me, which was something that had been going on for years. We were together for 5 years. And it wasn't just with one person, it was with multiple people. And that just caused everything to explode. And my life has never been the same since then. And have never been the same since then.
In one or two parts of the book, you spoke about missing your prior self, the sparkly self. And I underlined it a few times because I was like, I can think back to parts in my 20s. I'm like, oh my God, I was just so courageous and I had so much energy and I built the career of my dreams and in the parts of exhaustion where I felt like I had lost so many parts of my identity, there was certainly the death. And then there was like the yearning that might be, I don't know if it's extra punishment to myself or if there's a part that is remembering parts of myself that may show up again in a different way. But I remember that particular part. And even now there are parts of me that look like, oh, will there ever like that sparkle or that energy? Will that part ever return? Or is it like a real death of all of it? Yeah.
I love that you're bringing that up because that has been like a big recurring theme through these several years. And there are even times now where I'm like I want want to have some of that back, but I just know she doesn't exist anymore. And as you're saying that, we're just remembering the archetypes that we as women pass through during different seasons and the transition from maiden to mother. And I'm not a biological mother. And that's some of the stories I share in the book about a tragic abortion and failed fertility treatments. And kind of like as a side note, I've had a conversation publicly around wanting to also have another name for an archetype other than mother for women who are not mothers, but not to exclude mothers, but to include more of us. Like what is like a larger archetype for the season of life between maidenhood and now there's another one, queen before crone. But we can't get the maiden back. That's my sense. I think that there are certain qualities that continue to live through us, but it is a shedding, like a snake shedding its skin. It's
right. I just had this funny image of imagining a snake like going back, like, oh shoot, I want my skins back. Like a snake doesn't do that. It's like onward,
yeah.
And I was also pausing, and clearly we don't need to come up with an answer here, and thinking about what would that other word be. There is something about a caretaking element that comes up at the stage, whether it's for friends that are going through hard things, parents that are sick, partners, like the things like health comes up. There may be animals, but for me, there's definitely a caretaking portion that happens during this time.
There is, and I also wouldn't want to just have it be about caretaking. Because there's a maturation that happens. And this book also speaks to that. These heartbreaks, they mature us. They expand our capacity, not in the same way that elderhood does. That's another initiation that we go through, but there's definitely a big growing up and coming into deeper wholeness, into more right relationship with ourselves and other people in the world. There's like a sobering of what life really is.
Yeah, thank you for adding that element. That feels more accurate.
So something that includes all of that.
This is the first book of yours that I have read. I've just been introduced to you. And I'm wondering if you see that maturation within your books as well.
I do, although I'm friends and colleagues with a number of other authors, and some of them who've written multiple books, they share that they're embarrassed by their first books. I'm not. I'm looking over here at my bookcase because I have all three of them on book stands in a row. They're like three sisters. I love each of my books. And I feel like my first two books really stand the test of time. Like I really stand behind them. They're meant to be more like perennial books that we continue to return to. There is a maturity in each of those. And sometimes, or maybe all the time, when I go back and read portions of my books, I'm like, it's like medicine for me to hear. And I know that I write them. I do write them, but it's like a channel does open in me. And I feel like that channel has been in all three of them. And certainly my personhood was less mature and less evolved and kind of like didn't know what she had coming. But there's still a deep wisdom in them.
In this book, there's an element of, and I think I highlight it because it's something I've been curious about, the element of community as we grieve, and the element where you've named it already in this podcast of, and we need to go through this journey. Nobody can go through it for us. Can you speak a little bit about what community has been like, from even the heartbreak of it not being maybe what you needed or wanted, to the ways that perhaps certain groups or rituals helped you throughout your process?
Yeah. So another one of the intentions that I have for this book is to help to create more awareness for people who are suffering. And that came out of even just from day one, after I found out the news of the betrayal from the first heartbreak, a lot of people just fled my life. And one of my friends shared the analogy, it's like rats running from a sinking ship. And it was like what happened for some people was too confronting. It was too scary for them to contemplate that maybe that could happen to them too. Someone so close to their inner circle, or people just, it often happens in divorces and breakups, choose their camps to go into. But I felt very unsupported. There were a handful of people, a handful of my girlfriends in particular, that I could lean on, but I quickly saw like who was the true friend and who wasn't, and who was going to be moving to this next season of my life with me and who wasn't. And then as the heartbreaks continued over the next several years, much to my dismay, not at all according to my will or my agenda for life, more and more of those people fell away. So that by towards the end of it, by like 2020, my friendship circle was very, very sparse, very, very small. And so there was a lot of loneliness in the experience. Like, yes, I could hire people for support, but that's one thing. And also, if finances are limited, which often happens in heartbreak, just because it's, especially if you're self employed, because it's harder to keep things running and moving when you're going through a very challenging stretch. So then the communities that I did tap into, one was around ritual. And I got introduced to grief rituals, which was the work of Mali Doma and Sabafri Somé, both of whom are no longer living. But they brought these grief rituals over to the US, where the tradition was that no one is meant to grieve alone, that our individual nervous systems are not wired to grieve alone because the energy of grief is so enormous, and that we need the community to run that bigger energy.
Mm.
And that as a community, we also need to be coming together just to grieve the ongoing challenges of the world, of the collective, none of which are things that we do in our culture. So that was really supportive for me. And I also created some of my own rituals. Like in the story I share, in the book, I share a story of a ritual that I did after my abortion because I felt like I needed more support in holding and more processing around that experience, which just happened so quickly in a very clinical way. And so for me, the actual abortion procedure was not that challenging, but what came after was. And I did not anticipate that. And so ritual was one of the things that helped me with that.
I have a wise woman in our community who is a friend and perhaps a mentee of a man from the Navajo community, who shared with her that when a teepee is called, when people respond to that call, they know that they're also responding for themselves. that every person who shows up to a circle is being served while they're giving. And that feels really real to me and really real to my experience. I'll say here that I too have an abortion story that I haven't shared publicly. And the after took me to depths of grief that I've never felt before and didn't really know where to go. And my best friend who was pregnant with me the first time, and we like coincidentally completed at the same time the second time, to also be able to want to share in her joy while feeling my grief. And another friend sat next to me once and she said, in some communities, they'll wrap the woman in a blanket almost like she's in a womb, and they'll all hold her and just be with her and let her cry. And I thought, oh, that's nice. Like, that's not going to happen. And with the assistance of a plant medicine journey that we all did together, that was exactly what happened. And my ego that was like, don't make this about you. Don't just kind of kept getting stripped away. And then these waves of grief would come through and I was held. And there was nothing about being too much. And in that space, if it were too much, someone could simply go take care of themselves. And it had been a year or more since then, and trying to get pregnant again and unable to. And after those waves of grief that were seen and held, because up till then I was like, I've done so much grieving. When is enough grieving enough? But it was all by myself. It was in the confines of my home, and then processing what I could to then be normalish in life and not put anybody out. Yeah, then I felt these hands, like these energetic hands massaging my womb, and I lost a piece of tissue that I knew I had retained. I had said to the doctor, I think I retained anyway. I lost it in my hormones. Came back to normal. And it did result in being able to get pregnant again the next month. And so much of that for me, I think, was I actually being able to do that in the company of others. And from what I understand of trauma, is that we often go in feeling alone. And so that the way to come out of trauma physiology is to be in the presence of others, not just as we are victorious, but to be in the presence of others as we are feeling through the process.
Thank you for sharing that story. I'm just a big yes to all of that. As I heard you sharing that experience, just being wrapped and held, it was like those parts of me who went through that experience, feeling so alone, was like, oh, that would have been amazing. That would have felt really, really good. And as you were talking about passing that tissue, I remember that I had a similar experience, but in a different setting. I was working with like a pelvic care energetic healer
Mm,
some months after. And I think I was preparing to get pregnant again, on my own through IUI and then IVF. And I remember she like found a point of trauma. And this is I hope this isn't too TMI, but maybe it'll help people. But like found like a piece of trauma from it in my cervix and helped unwind that. And I remember laying on the treatment table and just my throat open and just this howl that came out. I was like, where did that come from? But it just released from my body. And she said, you're going to pass a big piece of tissue in the next 24 hours. And I did. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was like still in my body. I had no idea. There are a lot of layers to this. It runs really deep in us. And there isn't enough support. There isn't enough conversation around the truth of that.
I think you spoke a little bit to the speed of it, the speed that it can happen when there are medical challenges and or emotional or whatever it is, whatever is going on in life that would make one feel like a choice is necessary. And then suddenly there's a timing of this needs to happen fast if it's going to happen. And momentum, in my experience, can make it really hard to find myself and hard to find my compass. And there was a point where I was reaching out for so much medical information. And at some point, someone said it was a medical intuitive that just said, this is actually your baby is not attached. Like their soul doesn't have the ego stuff that we have. It's not attached. And the only way to know what to do is to go within. And having that moment to really try to tap in and put my hands on my stomach and try to listen to the baby and try to understand what their soul wanted. And I think was like another big underline that I had was when you wrote about your baby saying to you that the termination, I've also heard it like a pregnancy release, would be the right way to go. And when I got that message, what's so interesting, you said people with conflicting feelings as they're going into this procedure, was this thing of what my heart wanted was so different than what this soul was asking. And I think this is where like all the pain came from, was making a choice that wasn't in alignment with my heart. You know, all the other risks I had taken in life that were follow my heart, even though everything's a risk, even though I could lose everything, it was following my heart. And this one was following the call of a soul that didn't line up with what my heart wanted most. And at the very end of your book, you have, do you mind if I read a little quote? That moment when you know you need to break your own heart, when you know it's time to take that one last look, whether it's an actual home you've loved and need to move on from, a partner whom you'll never be with again, a baby nestled inside your pregnant belly, or a loved one you'll never see again. You know that life isn't giving you a choice. You must keep taking steps in a new direction, even though your vulnerable human heart and body truly don't believe that you'll ever be able to survive the pain, much less move on. I appreciated that part of speaking about moving in a direction that one knows is going to be a direction of heartbreak, especially in a community that so often says, follow your heart. For me, that was a little bit confusing.
It's confusing. And what comes up as I hear you say that is just truth with a capital T. Like one of my friends said once, the truth always feels good, even though it also feels bad. In the case of my abortion, I was considering it from the moment that I found out that I was pregnant, because it was a confusing situation. It was not a planned pregnancy. And I was exploring it from every possible direction, because I also really wanted to be a mother. I was 39 at the time. And I felt like if I don't go through with this pregnancy, like there's a good chance I'm not going to get pregnant again. There's a good chance I'm not going to be able to be a mother. And I got a lot of advice from very wise people, but it got confusing. And I did end up scheduling an abortion, but it ended up being canceled at the last minute because the doctor had her own medical emergency. And so I felt like that was a sign that I wasn't supposed to do it. And so I continued on, and it was later in the pregnancy, and then more came to light that made it clear that this was something I needed to consider again. And like you said, I was on a very tight timeline, and I was praying like I've never prayed before. And I had always thought that once I was pregnant, that I'd be connected to the soul of my child, but I was not. I could not find that connection until kind of the 11th hour. And that's often when God steps in, or grace steps in, a lot of times in the 11th hour, where I got that connection and I was able to hear that truth with a capital T. And it also reminds me of what we were talking about a little bit earlier about the mother archetype. And I really felt like, as this child's mother, I need to do what is best for this child, even though it is the last thing that I want.
Well, first, thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering if you could also share a little bit about the situation you were in, because I know this is another part of the heartbreak journey, and I feel like it's important for the listeners to hear about the dynamics in this relationship, if you don't mind sharing that, because from what I've heard, especially recently, some of the dynamics that seem to have been in that relationship are things that seem to match up with a lot of spiritual women who are highly intelligent and open to looking from other people's perspectives and trying to understand things from many perspectives. I don't know if you find that as like an accurate description in any way, but I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit of the relationship you were in at that time and that process as well.
That dynamic that you just described is very common and it is an actual thing. And I first learned about it after the fact through the work of Sandra L. Brown. And one of the books she wrote was How to Spot a Dangerous Man. And how it's often spiritual, confident, we talked about sparkly, like bright, successful women that tend to attract this kind of personality. Usually it's linked with something like narcissistic personality disorder, or in the case with this person that I was dating that I got pregnant with, it was the opposite. And so the dynamic that I was in, I was healing from what happened with my former fiance. And in retrospect, I should have waited much longer to date. Hindsight is 2020. I did the best that I could with where I was. I was also feeling a lot of pressure about my age because one of the things that happened with my former fiance was that we had been in a multi-year exploration of whether or not to have children together. And he ultimately came to a no. And I was trying to decide if that was okay with me or not. And so I was also in a lot of anger that I had wasted these years when he just didn't tell me that he was sleeping with other people. So I would have had time to go and chart a different course for myself. So I was really angry. And you mentioned in my bio, I do internal family systems. So I was talking about parts, like the parts of us. I had parts that were like on overdrive. Have to manifest the partner, have to manifest the baby, like the clock is ticking. Let's do it. And I did manifest the baby, but not in the way that I wanted to. And so anyway, I thought that leading that relationship was just kind of like healing from a regular breakup. I didn't understand the depth of the damage that had been done through the years of gaslighting and manipulation. And so I did the healing that I knew how to do. And I met this man and we started dating and I did all the things that, right in terms of things I didn't do with my former fiance, in terms of like vetting him, doing like a background check, kind of checking all the boxes. And there were still some things about him that reminded me a lot of my former fiance. Very handsome, very charismatic. Now I know it's called love bombing, where in the beginning of the relationship, they're just over the top with the romance, the adoration. And for someone like me, who I realized later on was a love addict, another great book to support women with something like this is, I think it's called Facing Love Addiction. So all of that love bombing was just like a drug for the love addict in me, especially coming out of my broken engagement where I felt more vulnerable. And it's also a thing, it's also very common for women coming out of those types of relationships to get back into a similar one because of that level of vulnerability. And it's kind of like a radar for that type of personality. It's like predator and prey. And I also want to say, like, I'm also taking responsibility that I stepped into both of these relationships. And there was a lot of atoning that I needed to do around what was it in me that even brought me into these relationships in the first place. But so those kind of markers in a man, the kind of the most charismatic man in a room is actually usually a dangerous man.
Mm.
And that love bombing. And then there's a point where that love bombing shifts, but you're already hooked in. And then there's a lot of gaslighting and blame and manipulation, and things start to get really confusing.
Can you describe the gaslighting? I want to also say that Rachel Halder will be coming on, I think, right after this one. And she describes a similar situation with a man who's really high up in the spiritual community, and they're both there together, and very similar beginning to what you were talking about, and the disorientation that happens after a long period of gaslighting. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all, in case, again, in case there's anyone listening who might not identify themselves there yet, but as you describe these things might also say, oh, okay, I'm not, maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe this is something I could research for myself and reflect on.
Well, first, it starts with a feeling of being unsafe. So you feel unsafe. You start to feel like you're not yourself. You're acting in ways that you don't usually act. And maybe there's a lot of jealousy that comes up, a lot of anxiety, a lot of insecurity, paranoia. And what you're hearing externally as you're maybe sharing concerns or noticing red flags or yellow flags, you are hearing very sophisticated explanations about what's going on that make a lot of sense rationally. And the person is speaking in a very intelligent way, but that is not matching these feelings of being unsafe or something's not right in your body. And also, even things are turned around, like whatever you're saying, that's actually your fault. It's something that you're doing, it's an insecurity that you have, that you are mistaken. And when that happens over and over again, it's just hard to tell what's real and what isn't. And one of the things that can happen is that, and I've spoken to other women who had this experience, and I had this experience with like, if you like wake up in the middle of the night and like want to check their phone or check their computer, it's like when that instinct is there, there's something happening.
Right? When that instinct is there and has never been there before. Is that
Yeah,
correct? Or like hasn't isn't like a part of your history? I heard
exactly.
I just tuned in this morning to your podcast with Jen Rastiopi, and I heard her share that exact moment of like, I'm not proud of this. I've never had this before. It was in the middle of the night. And the interesting thing too with Tracy's story that she shared on here, so I'm just not sharing anything that hasn't been shared publicly, was it was like 4 a.m. in the morning. I don't remember if it was she or her partner who woke up, but I think it was she woke up and asked the question that she had been afraid to ask.
Because it's like that's when like our rational minds are not active and that deeper intelligence can come through. And I remember times where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and or like super early in the morning. And one of my friends was a very early morning riser. I remember like texting with her and she's a real truth teller and being like, are you sure you should be with this person? Like, and we'd have these like truth conversations, but the daylight created more confusion. So
Mm.
like those middle of the night instincts, now I know it's like those are very real.
And so the way through there's of like, oh, well, how did you find out and how did you get out? But the finding out wasn't necessarily on purpose.
No, in that case, I had actually announced my pregnancy publicly. And through that, a woman that this man had been sleeping with since we'd first gotten together sent in an email to my customer care. So my business manager got it. Well, I was bleeding a retreat and she needed to tell me what was really going on. And that just led to a deeper unraveling of just understanding the bigger picture of the kind of person that I was with, which was far worse than I could have, like, than my mind could have ever imagined. And when I was considering my abortion, one of the things that I did was I met with a family lawyer and he came over and he talked me through all of my options logistically and also just knowing me as a person, knowing my work, just helping me to really feel into like how would it be to give birth to the baby, give it up for adoption? How would it be to give birth to it, keep it, try to get custody of it? And I was really able to see like there was no way that I'd be able to have any semblance of a normal life if I was trying to raise a child with this man, because he wouldn't give me custody. And my friend who's a lawyer, he had been in a also very tragic, he had a very tragic experience with a sociopath. And so he knew very intimately just the depth of damage that can be done in a very short amount of time. Because I had only known this man for 8 months. And the level of damage that had been done in 8 months, it was like mind blowing.
At the beginning, you mentioned the way that people might run and like friends. And this might not have been the point where they ran. I imagine when people listen to various stories, like for me, before I had the testing for my pregnancy, I was like, well, it's not going to matter. I'm going to have this baby no matter what. That there's that part that could say, oh, that couldn't happen to me, or that fearful part underneath of, oh, if it could happen to her. There's this thing that our bodies, like even just like our bodies can do. And I imagine, again, this is the importance of community. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but when we're trying to run away from what might be uncomfortable or separate ourselves from somebody else or from a situation versus to like come in and be with and understand how it can help all of us through something, through life. When I say something, through life. And I'm also thinking about capacity of the person going through the thing, but also of the friends supporting. And I don't know if I took this a little bit too much on a left turn, but as I was thinking about somebody else who went through a similar betrayal issue and them feeling like maybe it's like too much on their mother, and to be able to say like, maybe it is. And that's really hard. Like each person, and it's not because you're too much. It's just like every person has so much going on. And again, for community, if everyone took like a small piece, like if there were enough people to touch into, and then I hear you say, and over time, because then there's the endurance of it, not just like the first 40 days after the thing where a meal train can happen and friends show up, but the endurance of ongoing processing that comes with that.
Yeah, healing can be a long haul, whether it's like the heartbreaks that we're talking about or a health challenge or any sort of heartbreak. Various things come up as I hear you talking about that. So one is that something that I was really working with after these particular heartbreaks was like feeling so disoriented about my life and so confused. How did my life end up like this? How am I the kind of person that this is happening to? Or my life is completely unrecognizable to me and had taken just a drastic shift for what felt like the worst. So really reckoning with that and really reckoning how this happened. And another thing is that, I mentioned that with my former fiance, I misunderstood how long it was going to take to heal from that. And I spoke to another woman who had gotten divorced from a narcissist. And she cautioned, she said it took her several years to heal from that. And I really took that in. And I was like, wow, that seems like a really long time. And I trust her when she says this. And this past February was 8 years. And I remember last year was, last year's year 7. And I could really feel how right she was with that. So many layers within me, and also so much damage that had been done in my outer life that took time to reckon with and to rebuild. It's a long process.
When you start to recover from that, does the recovery feel like more self-trust and more orientation?
Absolutely. I feel so rock solid in my trust, self-trust, my intuition. And that's one of the gifts of this experience, I guess, because it really, really fortified that. And again, it took time to rewire that and to rewire it in a deeper way. But now it's like my own authority is first and foremost, period. And I'm in a radically different kind of relationship now with a kind of man that in the past, we actually knew each other in the past, but he was invisible to me because, I mean, he's a wonderful man, but it's a totally different kind of personality where there's a deep sense of safety
Mm.
in my system that, you know, I would have never even known to like look for that, to want that had I not been through everything.
I know that we're really nearing end of time, and okay, I guess there are these two things. One is if you could say to us a thing or two about anger and how you work with anger, because again, I think that's something that's missing from a lot of women's lives, where I think societally it's often people who are raised as boys or men may not be able to go into sadness, that women or people who are raised as women aren't really familiar with anger or what to do with it. So there's that. I'm just going to put two pins up there that we could move from one to the next, which is anger, and then just a thing or two about maybe the both and of when you're going through a hard time and you're like, do I meditate on Joe Dispenza? Do I, all the things of like, both of these things are things that I am still playing with, of being in a hard time and thinking like, okay, I should have the silver lining by now, or, oh, if I just get in the right headspace, but the truth of the exhaustion or the truth of the hardness. And yeah, so if you don't mind, if we could start with anger and just say a thing or two about your process of working with anger, and then about the validation, the self-validation, self-trust, I think is where that came.
So anger is a prominent part of the heartbreak journey. And like you said, it's often a place where women get stuck, where you can't pass through the full initiation of heartbreak if you do not fully process your anger. And I had suppressed a lot of anger in my life because I grew up in a household where my father in particular was very angry in a very scary way. And so I just did the opposite, wanted to stay safe and do because it's like, I don't want to be like that. And I write in the book about how I believe that was one of the core things that led me to my eating disorders in my teens. I discovered the release valve of bulimia, where all of this energy that was getting bottled inside of me, I could finally release it. And so particularly after my abortion, I experienced rage like I had never experienced before. And we actually took this out of the book because I think it could be a little bit controversial, but I'll just say it here now that I would fantasize. My rage was so intense that I would fantasize, and I would never do this in life, but I could understand the level of anger that would move through someone when they would do this, of like just taking out a machine gun and just like firing the machine gun, just like as a way to just release this like volcano of rage. And the therapist I was working with at the time, I had told her, I was like, I'm having like very violent fantasies of like shooting and stabbing and just, saying I would never do this to someone, but like this is happening in my mind. And she was like, okay, well, let's just sit here together and just fully go into that in your mind. And it felt so good just to have that permission, because sometimes I was scared to even leave the house because I was like, the slightest thing could just send me into a rage, like wanting to scream at someone or just kind of like just not even knowing where to put the energy. So there were many days during that time where I like didn't leave my house because the rage was so intense. So when we go through these portals, there's a backlog of all these old feelings that we haven't felt from previous hurts in life. And it's something that we need to consider when we're going through a heartbreak as we're older. It's like the grief, the pain, the anger that has been suppressed. It's time to process that too. And that can make it harder. And that is necessary for us to really come to that place of maturation and wholeness that we were talking about in the beginning.
When you shared about those images, it made me think about at the beginning of Peter Levine's book. I don't remember if it was in an unspoken voice or waking the tiger. He speaks about how often when people are doing their trauma resolution work, they'll start to have images of sexual abuse. And he said they're not always accurate. That what is happening is that the body feels in sensations and sometimes it feels in images. So the level of pain or grief or anger needs an image that matches the level that the body is feeling, not because it's something that's happened or something that you're going to act on, but it's the body just showing in any way it can the level of pain that it was feeling. And so he was just kind of warning as people go into these journeys of unpacking the backlog that the images aren't always there because of accuracy of action, but because of accuracy of the level of the feeling, the level of the betrayal, the level of the shame, the level of the anger. And I don't know that this is true for you. So I'm not here as a therapist trying to do that. I'm more just making a connection to something that I've both experienced as somebody who sits with people working through sensations and images in their body and hearing the story. And for me, perhaps I'm just trying to orient to it a bit as well.
Thank you for sharing that. I hadn't heard that, but that makes total sense. And that sounds like exactly what was happening at that time.
Yeah.
And that's also something that when an abortion counselor that I met with advised me, she said, allow yourself to think every thought, allow yourself to feel every feeling. That's the only way that you will make peace after this abortion. And I had enough capacity built that I could do that. I mean, it stretched me, beyond stretched me, but I really gave myself permission to go wherever I needed to go. And she was right. I am now, actually, I think maybe even like today or tomorrow is the anniversary of my abortion.
Wow.
Sometime like within the next day or two. I used to be very cognizant of the day, but that's just another sign of the healing. It's like, it's not living inside of me anymore. I'm completely at peace with it.
Part of the work that I do and that I've also, had somebody support me in is this idea of orienting to the event. And it's so interesting how at the beginning it often is in our body. And over time and through various work, I can notice like, oh, now it's outside of my body and to the right. And now it's here. And then it can like change shapes and the distance changes and there's more choice and boundary repair. And then it becomes more of a relational thing, almost like a conversation in some ways. But it was interesting at first to notice like, oh, this is piercing right through the center of my stomach. And it's like a rod. And later to be able to say, okay, this is where my eldest child is. I'm getting slightly off track, but there are so many empathic people who hold everybody, ancestors included, in their bodies. So to be able to kind of clean our house, our home, our body, and have everybody have a location that's not directly within us to orient to something a little further away is, yeah, a beautiful sign of healing and right distance and choice and all the things that change from trauma physiology to more health. And not that it's not health when it's happening, like it's all part of the process, which would bring up that one last thought that I was thinking as you were sharing about that peak anger. Something that my mentor, Bridget Vixens, will say is just the phrase, of course. And so sometimes when I'm working with people and they'll share something, their response will be like, of course you feel that way. Of course you're seeing those things. And then we can put it on a nervous system map or just orient it a little bit. And it can be so great to have somebody who feels stable and isn't scared by your experience. And I'm so glad that you had that at that time.
Yeah, me too. And then touching on your second question about how do we know when to sink into what we're feeling and when to try to change our circumstances.
Please.
It's a tricky dance. And so my heartbreak journey went on, we already talked about, went on much longer than I wanted it to. And so I always just felt like, especially like after my abortion, and I had been spending months healing that and things still weren't getting better for me. I felt like I should be doing more. And so I started doing a lot of Abraham Hicks. Like when I was walking my dog in the morning, I would just listen to all these YouTube videos and running it through my head every day. And then started really intensively studying Joe Dispenza, obsessed with Joe Dispenza and his work, and waking up and doing like an hour blindfolded meditation in the morning. I went to one of his retreats in Toronto, and I appreciate all the things that I learned through that. But I got to a point where I realized this is creating more resistance. This is actually making things worse for me, because I would be disappointed if I didn't stay in a state of high vibration or a state of gratitude, or I wasn't able to master myself, master my energy. And that made me feel even more like a failure when I already felt like so much of a failure. And so I was just like, screw this, like, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm just gonna just stop doing all this stuff and just gonna go back to the basics, which for me was just, my initial background with meditation was Buddhism, living in Thailand. I was like, I'm just gonna go back to my plain old sitting meditation. We're just gonna sit and be aware and just be with myself as I am. That was such a relief. It was such a relief. And so I think it's really personal, because I think there are times to do the Joe Dispenza stuff. And actually now I'm considering, like, do I want to start doing those meditations again?
There are such different points, right? Like at some point you mentioned, I wish I had the exact line, but it's like this feeling that life might be coming back. And for me, I call it like my internal imbulk, like where I'm like it's not spring energy yet. Like I don't have the spring energy, but there's a little, and just that at different points on our journey, different things are going to serve us. I interviewed Kristen Bostiels, who is an amazing yoga teacher, deep into the yoga community, and has been with Joe Dispenza for a while and has had stage 4 cancer for a few years now. And I really wanted to know, how does somebody both hold the values that Joe has of your thoughts create your life, and the honest experience of the days that are like, I don't know if this is worth living, and the amount of pain and the amount of exhaustion, and how to balance the two. And it just does feel like a dance of both acceptance of what is really there and the energy that we can tap into. And I think if it's less of a wish, which a man recently said to me, sometimes wishes are us being in denial of what actually is. But if it's less of a wish and more of, I'm going to give myself this gift of sitting in this vibration for a little bit, and I'm going to honor this other feeling I have, that I can pendulate between these feelings of grief and a few moments of what it feels like to be in this reality. And I'm starting to understand it a little bit more as a dance. But when I was working with the grief of my pregnancy release or my abortion, was, haven't I grieved enough yet? And when I'm using the breath to change my state, is that okay? And eventually thinking like, you know what? Sometimes it is okay, because I need to feed my 4-year-old. I haven't fed her yet and I'm still in my jammies. And it's like, those
You have to
things
get
need to
moving.
change, right? So like the allowance of the both and I'm just, I guess I'm like, is there a simple answer? Because
Well, I think the simple answer, and simple does not mean easy, right, is to stay connected to your inner knowing. And so for me, like, that's my relationship with God. And I don't say God in a religious way, but whatever your like higher power or, connection even to your higher self is, like, to start your day with that before tuning into the other voices in the world, or even the other voices of parts of yourself. It's like even asking that question, like, what's needed now? What is going to best serve now? What is going to best serve today? and just do that.
I appreciate how that weaves back in the self-knowing.
And the more that we do that, the more that we build that self-trust. And the more that we live our lives guided by truth with a capital T, which is ultimately what maturation is about. Carl Jung talked about individuation in midlife, where we live the first half of our lives really according to shoulds.
Mm.
And then the second half of our lives, we go through a midlife initiation. And that's something that every soul goes through. And so the years I'm writing about in this book were my midlife initiation. That's still like in the final, it feels like I think the final portions of it, that's kind of really coming into like your deep truth, living your deep truth.
I think that's a really beautiful place to end this conversation on. I actually know I have so many more questions, so many more places. Yeah, but I really appreciate your time. And I want to say that the card that I pulled when I just asked what would be a good thread to pull in throughout this, and it may or may not seem to the listener that this is a thread that we went on, but it's the perfection of your life. And because multiple times throughout this interview, you've said, that's not what I was planning on. That's not what I wanted per se. This is what I manifested, but it wasn't the way I wanted to manifest it. Throughout your book and at the end, and as you just mentioned, checking in with God or the truth with a capital T, and the maturation process, to look at this cycle as part of the maturation process. So even if when we're in the middle of something, we can't understand why, the silver lining is nowhere near to showing itself, that the idea that there is a perfection to our lives that are grander than what we can see in the moment is, for me, something to really hold on to.
Yes, and it's letting go of that personal perfection and opening to that divine perfection. And something else that can really help when we're in these times of uncertainty and disorientation is to attune the divine order. Divine order is always present. You don't need to know how to do that. You can just have the intention to attune to the energy of divine order, invite it into your psyche, to your body, to your life. And then we just follow the thread. Like there is a thread in the darkness, and we need to feel around for it, but there is a thread to follow. And the more that we attune to divine order, the more we're going to stay connected to that thread, and we're going to make it through.
Yeah. If there's one thing that the gift of this podcast for me is to hear so many incredible humans who, sometimes I'm interviewing someone in the middle, but often it's on the end in integration. And over, I'm just in awe of the other side. Like the whole thing being incredibly important, but I keep hearing these stories of the other side to just keep going. Yeah. So sometimes on my mini musings, the shorter ones that I do on my own, I end with a little prayer, which I sometimes will say to my listeners. Another way of thinking of this is that it activates the reticular activating system in our brainstem, that it helps us to see things that are already there, but that just by using the phrase, may I, or show me, or please, that we may begin to see or sense the very thing that's escaping us. So I might just borrow some of the words that you were just saying and with a, may I be humble enough to let go of my reasoning and my plan. Show me the divine thread, the divine order. Show me others and within myself, others who have had the courage to follow the thread before the other side is known. And remind me of the times in my own life where I too have already followed the breadcrumbs without throwing them down in front of myself. May I have faith, but may I also remember the stories of others and of myself. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today. And remember, change doesn't come from listening alone. I invite you to commit to taking one small or large, courageous action after today's conversation. One step you can take, if you haven't already, is to sign up for my Sunday journal. It's a weekly newsletter filled with inspiration and reflections about the intersection between spiritual entrepreneurship and fulfilling your potential to help you become the woman you truly are in every area of your life. You can subscribe at programs-sarahavansdover.com/journal. And if you found this podcast valuable, please share it with the women in your world. Also, I'd be very grateful if you'd leave a review. It helps others find resources like this, and I'd love to hear what's coming alive for you after listening today. Above all, keep going, and never forget the unique offerings you and your true self bring to the world. Until next time, I'm sending you my heartfelt support.